Imagine you're a German Panzer commander in the summer of 1944. You're sitting inside a 60-ton Tiger tank. You're surrounded by 4 inches of hardened Krupp steel. Your 88mm cannon can destroy any Allied tank from over a mile away. You have been told by German propaganda that you are the master of the battlefield. You are invincible. But suddenly, the earth beneath your tracks violently heaves upward. A concussive shockwave shatters your optical periscopes and bursts your eardrums. You didn't hear a whistle. You didn't see an enemy tank. You didn't even see an airplane. In a fraction of a second, your invincible Panzer division has been turned into a smoking graveyard of twisted metal and craters. How did the Americans do it? History Channel documentaries love to obsess over the armor thickness of the German tanks, but they completely ignore the ultimate equalizer of the Second World War. The U.S. Army didn't need a bigger tank to win the war. They had the Fire Direction Center, a mathematical meat grinder, and a top-secret artillery fuse that was guarded as heavily as the atomic bomb. This is the untold story of how American artillery, the true king of battle, didn't just defeat German panzer divisions. They erased entire grid squares off the map. If you read the post-war memoirs of German generals like Heinz Guderian or Erwin Rommel, you will find a recurring theme: extreme arrogance regarding their armor. When the U.S. Army landed in Europe, the standard American tank was the M4 Sherman. It was reliable, fast, and produced in massive numbers. But in a one-on-one frontal shootout with a German Panther or Tiger tank, the Sherman was at a severe disadvantage. German panzer commanders strutted across the battlefields of Normandy with a massive superiority complex. They believed that because their machines were heavier and their cannons were bigger, they owned the ground they drove on. They thought American troops were soft, inexperienced, and entirely reliant on mass production rather than martial skill. But the American military doctrine understood a fundamental truth of modern warfare that the Germans completely missed. The Americans knew that you don't need to build a 60-ton tank to kill a 60-ton tank. You just need a guy with a radio, a topographical map, and a direct line to the U.S. field artillery. The Americans didn't care how thick a Panzer's frontal armor was, because they had no intention of shooting at the front of the tank. They were going to drop thousands of pounds of high explosives directly onto its roof. They weren't going to aim at the tank at all. They were going to erase the zip code the tank was parked in. The secret to American artillery's terrifying efficiency wasn't just bigger guns. It was communication, standardization, and math. The U.S. Army perfected the FDC. Think of the FDC as the 1940s version of cloud computing. In the German and Soviet armies, artillery was often rigid and inflexible. A battery of cannons usually only shot at what was directly in front of their specific sector. If a Soviet unit wanted to call in a massive bombardment, it took hours of pre-planning, laying telephone wire, and moving physical guns. But the American system was a massive fluid network linked by lightweight field telephones and advanced FM radios. An American forward observer, often a lonely lieutenant hiding in a church steeple, a muddy foxhole, or crawling through a hedgerow, could spot a column of German panzers miles away. He didn't just call his own 4 guns. Through the FDC, he could request the firepower of his entire battalion, the division, the corps, or even an entire army group. Inside the FDC tent, men working with slide rules, protractors, and plotting boards calculated the geometry of death in a matter of seconds. Within 2 to 3 minutes of a forward observer whispering into his radio, dozens of artillery batteries scattered across miles of French countryside would all adjust their elevation and aim at one single grid square on a map. The German tank commanders had absolutely no idea that a pair of binoculars miles away had just signed their death warrant. The ultimate nightmare for the German military was an American tactical innovation called time on target, or TOT. Normally, if you are being shelled by artillery, You hear the first few ranging rounds land. You hear the incoming whistle. This gives you a few precious seconds of warning to slam your tank hatch shut, dive into a trench, or hit the gas pedal and move out of the kill zone. The Americans systematically eliminated that warning, using precise, synchronized stopwatches and complex flight time mathematics. The FDC coordinated the firing of every single gun in the sector so that every single shell landed at the exact same millisecond. Because shells travel at different speeds depending on the distance and the size of the gun, the orchestration had to be flawless. The massive 155mm howitzers firing from 10 miles away would shoot first. A few seconds later, the 105mm guns firing from 5 miles away would fire. Then, the heavy mortars. For the arrogant SS Panzer crews sitting in the drop zone, there was no whistle. There was no warning. 1 second, they were drinking coffee, checking their maps, and laughing about the American infantry. The next second, the sky literally fell on them. Hundreds of high-explosive shells detonating simultaneously created a concussive shockwave that defied human comprehension. And if the sound of the guns firing didn't reach the Germans until after the shells had already exploded, entire armored columns were turned into smoking craters before a single German soldier could scream. German engineers frequently boasted that a standard 155mm high explosive shell couldn't pierce the thick, sloped frontal armor of a Panther tank. And technically, on a test range, they were right. But the Americans didn't need to pierce the armor. They let physics do the work for them. A standard American 155mm shell weighed 95 pounds, packed with over 15 pounds of pure TNT or Composition B explosive. When a shell of that size detonates 3 feet from a tank, the laws of physics take over. The sheer concussive blast of a TOT barrage, the overpressure, would literally lift a 30-ton Panzer off the ground and flip it on its roof, or blow its tracks completely off the suspension. The shock wave would shatter the tank's delicate optical sights, snap the radio antennas, and ignite the external equipment. Even worse was a phenomenon known as spalling. The blast wave against the outside of the tank was so violently heavy that the kinetic energy transferred straight through the steel. The inside layers of the German tank's armor would flake off under the pressure, turning into high-speed, jagged shrapnel that ricocheted around the inside of the crew compartment like a shotgun blast. When American infantry cautiously advanced after a TOT barrage, they frequently found German Tiger tanks sitting in the mud, completely intact, with no visible holes in the armor. But inside, the crew was dead. The massive concussive pressure wave had ruptured their lungs and burst their eardrums. The machine survived, but the biological components inside were destroyed, while the forward observers on the ground were deadly. The Germans learned to fear something even more unassuming in the sky. It wasn't the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber. It was a tiny, unarmed, fabric-covered airplane with a top speed of 85 miles per hour. The Piper J-3 Cub, known in the military as the L-4 Grasshopper. These tiny planes were flown by artillery spotters. They flew low and slow over the battlefield, armed with nothing but a radio and a map. The psychological effect these planes had on the German military was staggering. German commanders actually issued strict orders to their anti-aircraft gunners and infantry. Do not shoot at the little planes. Why? Because the Germans knew that if they fired a single machine gun burst at an L-4 Grasshopper, the pilot would instantly spot their muzzle flashes. Within 3 minutes, that pilot would call the FDC, and an entire grid square of American artillery would vaporize the German position. German Panzer columns would literally stop their engines, hide under trees, and hold their breath until the little fabric plane flew away. The mighty German Wehrmacht was paralyzed by a guy in a flying lawnmower holding a walkie-talkie. As if the high explosives and the grasshoppers weren't enough, in late 1944, the Americans introduced a weapon so technologically advanced, so deeply classified, that it was initially forbidden from being fired over enemy territory in case a dud was captured and reverse-engineered. It was called the VT proximity fuse. Tanks are blind and vulnerable without their supporting infantry to protect them from bazookas and flanking maneuvers. Before the VT fuse, artillery shells had to hit the ground to explode, which meant a lot of the shrapnel was absorbed by the dirt or snow. The VT fuse changed everything. Inside the nose of the artillery shell was a miniature ruggedized radar transmitter. As the shell fell toward the earth, it bounced radio waves off the ground. When it sensed it was exactly 50 feet in the air, it detonated automatically. This rained down a perfect, inescapable 360-degree cone of razor-sharp shrapnel from above. Trenches and foxholes offered zero protection. When the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive at the Battle of the Bulge, their panzers were supported by thousands of elite infantrymen. When the American artillery finally unleashed VT airbursts over the Ardennes forest, it was an apocalyptic event. The airbursts turned the frozen pine trees into high-velocity wooden shrapnel, slaughtering the German infantry in the open. The panzers were suddenly left totally alone, blind, and surrounded by American bazooka teams. The master race wasn't defeated by superior genetics or willpower. They were physically shredded by American technological, industrial, and mathematical superiority. The German High Command never found an answer to American artillery. They spent the entire war trying to build thicker tanks, bigger cannons, and heavier armor. But they completely failed to understand that the future of warfare wasn't about the size of the steel box you drove. It was about the speed of your communication network. The American GI didn't have to fight fair, and he didn't want to. If a German panzer division parked in a forest, the U.S. Army didn't send tanks into the trees to fight a noble face-to-face duel. They just called the Fire Direction Center, removed that grid square from the map, and walked over the ashes the next morning. The myth of the invincible German panzer didn't die at the barrel of another tank. It died in the muddy foxhole of a 20-year-old forward observer with a field telephone and in the mathematics of the U.S. field artillery. So, what do you think was the real killer of German armor in World War II? American tanks or the communication, calculation, and artillery network behind them? And if you were a panzer commander, what would have terrified you more? The shell you could see coming or the bombardment you never heard until it was already too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of true historical justice. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget history. We will see you in the next video.